In this video, I want to talk about terminology specifically in regards to the FHIR spec. And it's going to be a very high level presentation, but just to get you familiar with the FHIR aspects of terminology. To kick this off, highly recommend that you go and just Google search FHIR terminology module or just FHIR terminology. And they'll present you with a lot of information about just using terminologies in FHIR, and you're going to get this beautiful diagram that shows you all the relationships of how terminology works. We're going to go through some of these in more detail in a couple of other sections, but what I want to do in this video is just highlight some of the key things to think about when we're using terminology in FHIR. The first of which is just the idea of using coded values in FHIR. So directly from the FHIR spec, what they note is that throughout it, coded values are always treated as kind of a pair, a system and code, if you will. And generally, there are four elements that you think about when you're using these coded values that are seen here: system, code, version, and display. On the left-hand side is a JSON representation of it. And on the right-hand side, I'm just going to go through a couple examples and talk about this a little more. The system is kind of like the entity or system that defines the code itself. So we talked about LOINC earlier being one of the common code systems used for labs. So the system would have something like http loinc.org, and that would be the system. It's in the format of a URI. Code is a string value that basically identifies the code. It's usually more machine readable, so you usually can't just interpret what this concept is by looking at the code. And then usually they're used as a pair. So this code is only interpretable by comparing it to the system. It's always that code and system that will tell you more about it. Now, the other two, version, is really important because codes could change over time, and some do. This is not something in practice I see very often in terms of like seeing a version passed on, but it's something to be very cognizant about if and when those code systems change. And they do, it's just that I don't see it very often in my practice right now. But something to note, versions could be important. If someone sends it, you should be able to handle for it. And then there's display. And display is more of the human readable interpretation of what this code means in the context of this system. And in this case, this code in the LOINC system reads number of steps in unspecified time pedometer. So these are the four things you think about when it comes to coded values in FHIR. And then really, at minimum, it's that code and system pair. Now, also, when it comes to coded values in FHIR, there's three data types that you really will see. So you have code, which is just the code only, and the system is implied. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a bit. Then there's also coding, which is just the code and system. And then the most common one you see is the codable concept. And so this one is special in the sense that it also has a plain text data element, and then it's comprised of one or more coding elements. So here are some examples. This is directly from the FHIR spec itself. You can see we have an observation resource here. Status is a data element, and then code is the data type. So this code, if you look all the way to the right, has registered, preliminary, final, and amended. Whatever the data type is code, the code is only there, but the system is implicit. So you don't actually see the system here. It's also implied. And if you want to know where this system is, you can click on the value set, which is hyperlinked in this observation status, and you can find what code system it's referencing. So in this case, it's the ho7.org FHIR / observation status. That's the system, but it's implied, and you know it's implied because when you look at the JSON, you just see the data element of status and then the value of final, and final is the code. So that's code. Coding, this is directly from FHIR, has that system and code. System and code. And in JSON, this is what it looks like. It's just the system and code, and then sometimes they also have a display. I think from what I've been seeing in practice, it's usually about like a 60 to 70% that you see the display, but almost always, I shouldn't say almost always, most common is you have that system and code. And then the last one is the codable concept, and this is still using the observation resource. So body, site, method, type applies to are the data elements. And then you can see the data types are all codable concepts. And then on the far right, you see the just kind of a description of what that data element is supposed to represent. And then once you click into it, you can see more about the value set and the code system that it binds to. In this case, the codable concept, you'll see a very common pattern here of usually, not always, but you have an internal code. So whatever your organization is, so let's say you're a hospital, you may have some internal code that you're using. In this case, the system is Acme Labs, so their system, and they have a special code for NEG, which is negative. But then they usually have it mapped to a standard terminology. In this case, they're mapping it to Snowman. And this is a very common pattern for interoperability. You have your internal codes, but you also want to have some type of standard that when you're talking with the external world, you're able to communicate and have that shared meaning. And then with codable concepts, you also have this plain text field. And that's the end of that video, and we're going to move on to the next one about key FHIR resources.